Hi, everyone, and welcome back for another episode of Malice in the Mitten. I'm your host, Tracy Preston, along with my bestie, Christine Mulligan. Hey, Christine.
Hey, Trace. How's it going? What are we getting into? What kind of malice you got for me today?
Well, do you believe that things happen for a reason? Like maybe
Absolutely.
like a chance running with a stranger. Is it by chance or is it by design? Well, that's just what happened to our researcher and writer of the show, Angela Sinclair. It didn't happen to her, but it did happen to her sister-in-law, who then called and told Angela all about it. So let's get into it. This is Season 5, Episode 28, Jeffrey Titus. Now, this next statement is from Angela to you all. Quote, "The story we are about to tell you doesn't begin like our usual shows. It doesn't start with the victim of a horrible murder. In fact, it begins with something a little different. This story came to my attention from my sister-in-law, who met a man at a grocery store. A man who asked her what the best way to buy canned vegetables was. You see, he had been in prison for over 2 decades and didn't know anything about anything any longer, like how to use a computer or a smartphone, or even to buy groceries in this modern world. My sister-in-law is a very suspicious person, as it's just her nature. She doesn't just give her trust willy-nilly, and she's usually standoffish to strangers. And yet she is a very caring person, as she tends to animals and special needs children. For some reason, this man seemed drawn to her, and they actually struck up a conversation with him telling her his story. When the conversation ended and she walked away from him, she decided to check out his story. Could everything he said to her be true? Well, she found his story, and it was true. What she was reading lined up with what he said almost word for word. He was wrongfully convicted for the murders of 2 men, 2 hunters. I do find it a little ironic that a man who spent his life as a trapper and hunter found my sister-in-law, whose life is dedicated to saving the lives of animals, struck up a conversation with her. This is the true story of Jeffrey Titus and the 2 murdered hunters. Fall in the Mitten is something hunters here eagerly await for, as it's hunting season. Shotgun blasts are not an uncommon sound this time of year. It was the afternoon of November 17th, 1990, when 18-year-old Bobby Brown, his stepfather Mark Perry, and a friend Doug Estes entered the game area at the Fulton State Game Area in Kalamazoo County. It's your favorite city. The best time to head out to hunt is either in the early morning or late afternoon into the early evening. After entering the gaming area, the 3 men went their separate ways per usual to get a place to hunt. But after hearing a few shots fired off, Brown would make his way back toward what he had heard. He assumed that either his stepfather or Doug had gotten a deer. But what he thought he would see versus what he saw couldn't have been more different. Brown found Estes and another man, 37-year-old Jim Bennett, lying on the ground several feet apart. Both had been shot in the back at close range. Both were dead. Bennett's weapon, a muzzle-loading rifle, was on the ground, but Estes's 12-gauge shotgun was nowhere to be found. Darkness fell as police arrived. An initial search yielded nothing. The lights set up attracted the attention of 38-year-old Jeff Titus, whose farm bordered the game area. Police were still on the scene when Titus and a friend, Stan Driscoll, drove up from Titus's property. Titus said that he and Driscoll had just returned from hunting on property about 35 minutes north. 2 days later, on November 19th, 1990, Titus called police and reported that he had found a shotgun on the edge of the game area. Now, Titus was a trapper and said that while checking his traps, he spotted the gun. Detectives were pretty much at a standstill with their investigation of the shootings. They thought that drugs may have been the motive, as Bennett grew marijuana and Estes allegedly at one point talked about robbing Bennett's marijuana, which, by the way, is not uncommon. So if you're growing, you better be careful and keep your mouth shut about it. Sorry, I just had to throw that out there. All right, back to the story. So why these two men ended up murdered on November 17th was something that just didn't make any sense. There was one possible suspect, a man whose car had gotten stuck in a ditch near the game area not long after the shots were heard. Brown told police that he heard squealing tires in the distance after hearing the gunshots. A witness told police that the man in the ditch was sweating and refused an offer to call police for help. Then, before long, a man passing by in a truck stopped and offered to help pull the car out of the ditch, and just as soon as the man was free, the driver quickly sped off. The murders remained unsolved for a decade. It was in 1998 that a cold case squad was formed by the Kalamazoo Police Department, and in 2001, the unit turned its focus on the murders of Estes and Bennett, and it didn't take detectives long before they were able to close the decades-old murders.
But wait a minute, hold on a second. So, this was a cold case for 10 years, and this guy, Titus, was the one that found the shotgun at the edge of the gaming zone. Am I following you?
Yeah, like his property kind of butts up against this gaming area.
Okay, so he found the shotgun right after the murders happened.
Mm-hmm.
And then 10 years later, they come back looking at him?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, these two men were murdered during hunting season in the gaming area.
Right.
So other than the shotgun missing, it could have just been an accident and someone didn't even realize that they had shot them. I mean, does that kind of thing happen? I would imagine it would.
People do get shot, but the thing that's weird with this is that these two guys were basically both shot smack dab in the middle of their back.
Oh.
Two guys right together. So that's a little suspect.
Okay. We're wearing camo, right?
Well, I mean, hunters wear camo, but they're also supposed to wear like something bright to avoid getting shot. Right? Because, I mean, hey, all of a sudden some hunter might see something moving, and if they're not very experienced, they might just fire off a shot willy-nilly and kill you. I mean, it does happen, but I think more often than not, it's murder, right? Oopsie, it was an accident. Like, I've definitely seen stories about husbands and wives hunting together, and oops, one of them gets shot.
Oops, yeah. Yeah. I would imagine, I don't know. I would think that would happen more than it actually does, I guess. I don't know. What do I know? I'm not a hunter. Okay, go ahead. So keep going.
Okay. On December 12th, 2001, detectives arrested Jeffrey Titus. At the time of the arrest, he was 49 years old. Remember him, right? He's the trapper that had found that shotgun on the edge of his property. Titus had his farm, and at this time also had been in the animal control business since the downturn of the economy, and his trapping business wasn't making much money. So Titus was charged with the 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of using a firearm to commit a felony. In July of 2002, Titus went to trial at the Kalamazoo County Circuit Court. The prosecutor, Scott Brower, described Titus as a former Marine, an officer in service to President Nixon, and a former security officer at the Veterans Affairs Hospital in Battle Creek, but also described him as a vengeful property owner who had threatened anyone who stepped foot on his property from the Fulton game area. In his opening statement to the jury, Brower said that other hunters would testify about their run-ins with Titus, who had purchased the farm in 1990, just a few months before the murders. Quote, "You will find these witness accounts so remarkably similar that the only reasonable conclusion would be that he was the one that confronted Doug and Jim in the same area, in the same manner as the others. And that confrontation escalated into murder." But here's the thing. There was no physical or forensic evidence linking Titus to the crime. So if you're wondering what the prosecution's theory was, well, I'll tell you. At the time of the double homicides, Titus said that he and his friend Driscoll had spent the day hunting on the property of two farms north of the Fulton game area. They believed that after the hunters went their separate ways to hunt, Titus got in his car, drove to his farm, spotted Estes and Bennett, confronted them about hunting on his property, and bam, he killed them. For the first few days of the trial, the prosecution's evidence was a steady stream of people who had worked with Titus at the VA hospital, as well as neighbors and others who hunted in the area. Their testimony had two primary themes. One, that Titus was a territorial man and that Titus would not hesitate to confront any hunter who wandered onto his property. And two, that Titus often spoke of the two hunters that were killed near his property line and did so in ways that were quite unsettling. Bonnie Huffman testified that in 1990, prior to the murders, Titus had confronted her while she was hunting on her parents' farm, which was just adjacent to Titus's farm. She said that Titus was waving a pistol around, told her she was on his land, and told her to get out. She said the incident had frightened her so much that she never hunted in that area again, even though she knew it was not on his property. That would freak me out as well. I mean, what's going to stop this man from shooting you?
Okay, so he has threatened people, so he's not completely innocent.
Right, so you can see why they'd be, focusing in on this guy.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, I'm just wondering, how the heck did that happen?
Right.
And the fact that he turned in the gun, if he was the murderer, why would he turn in the gun?
Well, sometimes people do that, right? They insert themselves into it, or like we've talked about before, if there's crime scene tape and police officers asking questions, sometimes that killer puts themselves right in the crowd.
That's true. All right, go ahead.
All right. On the day of the murders, according to Huffman, she had just come in from hunting on the farm when Titus drove up at about 5 p.m. Quote, Titus said he had just found 2 dead bodies on his farm, that she did not hear the sirens of the emergency vehicles until after Titus had reported finding the bodies. She told the jury that she came forward after Titus was charged because she heard that he had told authorities he didn't come home from his day of hunting until after dark. Quote, "It upset me because he followed me into my mom and dad's house, and that was before dark." She also said she heard the squealing of tires and a car engine revving. She said she walked out of the thicket and saw a car in the ditch, that she climbed over the fence and asked the driver if he wanted help. Quote, "This gentleman wanted no help whatsoever, which to me was very strange in the country because you just don't turn down help when you get help offered to you out there." Richard Adams testified that he was bow hunting for deer in the game area in late September or early October in 1990. He said he was in his hunting blind when Titus approached him, shotgun in hand, Titus claimed the blind was on his property. Adams testified that, quote, he was a very angry gentleman, very forceful. He wanted me off the property now. He had his hand near the trigger and just kept waving it around, loosely waving it around. I mean, if the safety had been off, if he'd squeezed the trigger, I could have been shot. 16-year-old Chris Whitby testified that he, along with his stepfather and two uncles, were hunting in the Fulton Game area in 1991, the year after the murders. He said he shot a deer and tracked it into a cornfield adjacent to the game area. He said he was walking out of the cornfield when Titus approached him and said, quote,
"What are you doing on my property?"
all while pointing a gun at me. We had a few words, then my uncles and stepfather heard us going back and forth with one another, so they headed over as they were only about 50 yards away. They said, quote, what in the hell are you doing pointing a gun at him? Titus said he'd been having a lot of problems, I guess, with hunters going on his property and trespassing, and if he was to catch me on his property again, he'd take it in with the law. Whitby went on to testify that the direction Titus was holding his shotgun, if it would have went off, it would have hit me. I was scared. I mean, if someone walks up, and starts pointing a gun toward their direction, any hunter's going to be scared. I don't care who you are. Whitby's father, Ted, also testified about what happened. He said he heard the shooting, followed the sounds, and came upon Chris. He went on to say that Titus was holding a shotgun, waist high, aimed at Chris, and that he was ornery, pissed off, and had a bad attitude. He did say that words were exchanged between them, and he told his son to come on and let's get up out of here. Another man by the name of Marley Dale Beatty was called to the stand. He testified that 2 or 3 years after the murders, he was hunting in the Fulton Game area, sitting in his hunting spot when Titus, shotgun in hand, approached him. He said that he owned all the adjacent land around him and his buddy. They wanted to hunt it all. He wanted me to leave. And he said,
Guys are known to be shot out here in the woods.
Beatty went on to say, quote, the way he was looking at me, and the way he had his gun over his arms, well, I'll just tell you, he scared me. So I flipped my gun off safety where he could hear it. And I told him that shit works both ways. Get the hell away from me. And he stood there for a minute, and then he walked off. Then there was a man by the name of Michael Finn that took the stand. He testified that he had worked at the VA hospital as a fellow officer with Titus. He told the jury that Titus had recounted finding the shotgun and that Titus claimed he cleaned the gun before calling the police. John Calican, who was Titus's supervisor at the VA, also testified in 1992 that in 1992, Titus told him about finding the gun, cleaning it, and holding onto it for a couple of days before calling the police. Quote, he felt the police had insulted him during the course of the investigation that they had conducted, and it was his way of getting back at them. Marion Beardsley Gibbs testified that she worked at the VA as a coordinator of the homeless programs. She said that 4 or 5 days after the murders, Titus talked about finding the shotgun and how poorly the search had been conducted. She said Titus also described the position of the bodies. She said Titus, quote, became very flushed and sweaty and just talked faster and faster to that point. We couldn't have a conversation. He seemed to get really agitated. Marianne went on to say that Titus claimed to have kicked Estes and Bennett off his land prior to the murders, calling them sons of bitches. Daniel Israelis testified that on November 29, 1990, 12 days after the shooting, he was at a deer reporting station at the Fort Custer Training Center in Augusta, Michigan, following a hunt. At the station, he saw Titus, who was also reporting deer that he had shot. He went on to say that Titus claimed to have been at home on his farm when he heard the gunshots, and that was around 4:30 p.m., and that Titus reported both victims had been shot in the back at close range. Michelle Smock, another VA employee, testified that during a conversation in 1992 or 1993 with Titus, that he talked about the shooting. She said he, quote, just said that they deserved it for being on his property because they were trespassing. During cross-examination, Smock described Titus as a talkative man who exaggerates his possessions. Amy Branham was a secretary at the VA hospital, and she testified that in early 1993, Titus, quote, mentioned to me that there were 2 dead hunters found on his property and that they were trying to prove that he did it, but there was no way that they could prove it. She said he laughed as he said it, at which time I became very uncomfortable. Donna Hutchins, another VA employee, said a couple of weeks after the murders, Titus was outside on a smoke break when she took a patient out. Quote, I distinctly remember him saying that he would have no problem, no qualms whatsoever about shooting someone if they were on his property. She said she was, quote, kind of astounded. I felt that he meant it and that he would. He said he would have no problem whatsoever shooting someone in the back if they were on his property. The prosecutor asked Donna, quote, did he, meaning Titus, make any statements about how he felt that the hunters were dead? He was excited about it. They were on his property and that's what they deserved. I said, you did this? And he said, probably. And was smirking and like, I don't know how else I can say it, but like smart alecky. It was like it made him more manly or something to me. She also said, quote, I was afraid of him. On cross-examination, Hutchins said that, quote, Titus was considered a braggart, particularly in his conversations with women. However, on that occasion, I sincerely believe he was telling the truth. There were more witnesses from the VA. One testified that Titus described the victims as poachers. Another said that Titus complained of having difficulty sleeping, saying, the ghosts are back. Marcia Alcook, who helped organize the deer hunt at Fort Custer, testified that Titus told her that if he caught a poacher, he would, quote,
skin them alive and pour salt on their bodies.
Guy Cherry testified that he was in the Army National Guard in Battle Creek and that Titus would occasionally stop in. He said that in 1991, when Cherry mentioned wanting to get a gun to take up hunting, Titus said, quote, that he'd catch a lot of people on his property all the time, and he could confiscate their guns and grind down the serial number and sell it to me pretty cheap. He said Titus also said that, quote, if anybody ever gave him a problem, that he would have no problem blowing them away. He'd just tell the cops that they drew first. Rodney Clute, a wildlife biologist for the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, he testified that part of his job duties was to inspect crop damage due to wildlife. He said that in the fall of 1991, nearly a year after the murders, he visited Titus's farm to inspect for crop damage. Clute said Titus volunteered that he was a, quote, prime suspect in the murders and that Titus's supervisor believed he was guilty. Clute went on to say, quote, and I was also rather surprised by the way he stated it. The only term I could use was pride. It was almost like he was proud of the fact that he was a suspect. Marty Johnson, a Kalamazoo County Sheriff's deputy, testified that he was in charge of the Forensic Science Laboratory and Evidence Technician Unit. He said he went to the scene and saw that the bodies each had a shotgun wound in the center of their back that had exited their chests. Johnson said that Bennett's muzzleloader was examined for fingerprints. 2 prints belonged to Bennett, the owner of the gun, and a third was not identifiable due to insufficient characteristics. Johnson said that the gun that Titus found was also examined, but no prints were found. The prosecutor asked if the lack of fingerprints would be consistent with the gun being wiped clean prior to or after handling. Johnson's response, quote, "Being wiped clean would be one explanation why latent prints would not be recoverable, and that Estes had been killed with a single shotgun slug, and Bennett had been killed with shotgun pellets." Detective Michael Workema testified that during the investigation, Titus was interviewed and denied committing the murders. Titus said that he and his friend Stan Driscoll hunted on the farm of Larry Crandall during the morning the day of the murders, and on the adjacent farm from Gerald and Eloise Shepard later that day in the afternoon. Titus said he shot a deer, but did not gut it in the field as was customary, because he intended to take the deer back to his farm and use the entrails to bait his traps. He said that he and Driscoll returned to his farm after dark and saw the lights from the crime scene. Ron Petrowski, a Portage, Michigan police officer, testified that he drove from the Shepherd farm to Titus's farm several times, and that the trip takes approximately 35 minutes. Michael Brown, a Kalamazoo County Sheriff's detective, testified that he interviewed Titus about the statements made by the VA workers. Brown said Titus denied making them. Titus did not testify on his behalf, which is the smartest thing, really, honestly. I think any attorney's going to tell you that. The defense would call Driscoll, who testified that he and Titus did go hunting that day on the Crandall and Shepherd farms. He admitted that they did not hunt together and that most deer hunters split up while hunting. He went on to say that the two of them would always meet up at the end of the day, and no, he could not stay where Titus was during the time the two of them were separated while hunting, and that the two men had hunted together for almost 10 years, and in all that time, Titus would never leave the woods before dark. Larry Crandall testified that Titus and Driscoll hunted on the Crandall Dairy Farm on the morning, the day of the murders. Crandall said he had known Titus since he was a teenager when Titus had worked on the Crandall farm. Paul Frederick testified that he met Titus while he was a counselor at Penfield High School in Battle Creek when Titus was a junior. Over time, they began hunting together and hunted for many years. Frederick said that Titus never hunted deer with shotgun shells loaded with pellets. He only used slugs. He went on to say that Titus did own a 12-gauge shotgun, which had a smooth bore barrel that Titus later replaced with a rifle barrel, and that no hunter would use pellets in a gun with a rifle barrel. When asked whether Titus ever used alternating loads, one shell with the slug followed by a shell loaded with buckshot, Frederick said that if he had caught Titus doing so, he would have berated him, quote, "I don't believe in it. I always told him, if you can't hit a deer with a slug, you don't have any business shooting buckshot." Helen Nobbs testified that she lived across the street from the Fulton game area. She recalled that on the day of the murders, a neighbor called and reported a car in the ditch at the corner that needed help. She said she drove to the ditch and found the car nose down in the ditch, and he wanted someone to pull him out. She offered to call the police and get a tow truck. After she asked about the police and the tow truck, she said the man, quote, "got very agitated and said he did not want to call the police." And that's when the truck pulled up. The gentleman in the truck said he'd pull him out of the ditch, so I went home. She said the man was sweating and nervous, and that when she heard later about the murdered hunters, she called the police. "I felt that it might be related somehow." She went on to say that prior to this trial, she was shown a photographic lineup from the defense investigator, and that she'd identified one of the men in the photographs as looking quite like the man in the ditch. And if you're thinking she ID'd Titus, she didn't. The man in the photo was Charles Dean Lamp. The jury had been excused while the defense presented evidence to Judge Philip Schaefer. The evidence was that while Charged Dean Lamp was serving time in prison, he had told an inmate that he had committed the murders of the two hunters. However, when the defense sent an investigator to interview Lamp, he denied involvement. Well, of course he did. What in the actual?
Okay, but this guy, the man in the ditch, he was spoken about by a couple of people already.
Mm-hmm.
You keep mentioning this guy in the ditch and how he's very squirrely and he doesn't want anybody to come help him and he didn't want the cops around. So how come they didn't run down his trail too far?
Yeah, it's really strange that, hey, we sent an investigator to interview this dude and he denied it, so he didn't do it.
He denied it, but he was already in prison when he was denying it, right? He was in prison for something else?
Yes, he was. Because remember, this is like 10 years later.
Right. Mm-hmm. So, sounds a little fishy that you got somebody murdering people and then they end up in prison anyway for something else.
Mm-hmm.
You know what he was in prison for?
I don't know.
Yeah, that would be interesting to know.
Yeah, it would. And what person is going to deny murdering a couple people when a police officer comes to you?
Everybody.
And they just let it be.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So go ahead.
All right. Brower, the prosecuting attorney, in his closing arguments, portrayed Titus as a man who was so obsessed with his property that he left the woods where he was hunting with Driscoll, drove home, confronted and killed Estes and Bennett, then drove back to meet up with Driscoll at the end of the day. And guess what? The jury bought it. On July 19th, 2002, Titus was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of using a firearm to commit a felony. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The Michigan Court of Appeals upheld the conviction in February of 2004. The Michigan Supreme Court denied permission to appeal in November of 2004. Titus filed a federal petition for a writ of habeas corpus in February of 2006. Now, to put it in simple terms, a writ of habeas corpus requires that a person who is in custody be brought before a judge or court and that they be able to challenge the custody related to unlawful detention or illegal imprisonment. The petition was denied in 2009, and the denial was upheld by the Sixth Circuit U.S. of Appeals in 2011. In 2013, the Michigan Innocence Clinic, also known as MIC, at the University of Michigan Law School, accepted Titus's case on the recommendation of Bruce Wiersma and Royce Bellette, who were detectives assigned to the case right after the murders. At the time, both detectives were convinced that Titus's alibi was solid based on their interviews of Larry Crandall and Gerald and Eloise Shepard. They had cleared Titus of involvement in the crime. In August of 2014, MIC filed a petition for relief from judgment. The petition cited evidence pointing to Titus's innocence, including Huffman's initial report to police said nothing about Titus coming to the farm at 5 p.m. before the murders were reported. Huffman's mother, Patricia Burnside, initially reported to police that Titus arrived around 8 or 9 p.m. that night. Gerald Shepard and his wife, who did not testify at the trial because they were, quote, not of sound mind at the time, had verified Titus's presence on their farm during interviews with Wiersma and Bellette, both of whom could have been called as witnesses at trial. Soon after the murders, Gerald and Eloise Shepard had signed a statement saying that they knew Titus was on their farm until dark because they saw him drive his truck out of the driveway with a deer. Later, their son had been interviewed and told reporters that his father was the only one with dementia and his mother had been sharp in mind still. No one asked them to testify. When asked if his parents told the truth, he said yes. They were honest people. Mrs. Shepard would have seen or heard Titus leaving the property, as he would have had to drive past the dining room window, and so there was no way that he could have driven to his farm and committed those murders. Less than 1 month after the murders, Titus had taken a polygraph examination and had been deemed to be truthful when he denied involvement in the crime. When Titus became the focus of the cold case investigation, Detective Richard Madison told the team that the evidence indicated there were 2 gunmen, not 1. He based that conclusion on the location of the bodies, the fact that one was shot with a slug and the other with buckshot pellets, the angle of the entrance wounds indicating they were shot directly from behind, and the unlikelihood of Titus being able to complete a round trip and the murders and still be back on the Crandall farm. The petition asserted that the prosecution had failed to disclose Madison's conclusion. In March of 2015, an evidentiary hearing was held before Judge Alexander Lipsey. Ballot and Wiersma both testified that they believed Titus's alibi was truthful based on their interviews with the Crandall and Shepard families. Madison testified about his belief that there were 2 shooters and how his conclusions had been rejected by the cold case squad. John Nixon, a mechanical engineer, testified that based on his review of the crime scene photos and the autopsy evidence, the existence of 2 gunmen was, quote, more plausible. In April of 2015, Judge Lipsey denied the petition. He said that while Madison's conclusion was not disclosed to the defense, he would not rule on whether it was a violation of the requirement that prosecutors disclose exculpatory evidence. The judge said that not only would the, quote, theory's persuasive impact be somewhat deflated by the testimony of every other member of the investigative team, of which Madison was a member, but that reduced impact would have been juxtaposed with the substantial inculpatory evidence from, well, over a dozen individuals who described frightening encounters with Titus in which he either threatened them with a firearm in the same area as the murders or discussed the killings in such a way as to prompt the listeners to suspect his guilt. 3 years later, in 2018, Titus filed another federal petition for a writ of habeas corpus. In 2019, while that case was pending, producers Jacinda Davis and Kevin Fitzpatrick teamed up with Investigation Discovery, a true crime television program, to reinvestigate the case. Ultimately, they collaborated with Susan Simpson's podcast, Undisclosed, to present a compelling portrait of Titus's innocence. As part of that reinvestigation, Huffman said that Titus came to the farm about 8 p.m. When asked about her trial testimony that Titus was there as early as 5 p.m. on the day of the murders, Huffman said she only remembered one thing about the trial, and that was she had complimented Titus on his necktie. Perhaps most significantly, they learned about Thomas Dillon, a serial killer convicted of killing multiple hunters and outdoorsmen. He had been arrested in 1993 and had pled guilty to 5 counts of first-degree murder in Ohio to avoid the death penalty. He also was a suspect in an unsolved murder of an outdoorsman in Pennsylvania. They filed public record requests for documents in Ohio. In the documents they obtained, Simpson and Davis learned that while in prison, Dillon told a cellmate that he once killed 2 hunters who were standing close together in a county where no one could prove Dillon had ever been. The cellmate later signed an affidavit for the MIC. I actually remember watching a story about that guy. Subsequently, MIC Director David Moran discovered a file of about 30 pages on Dillon labeled, quote, serial killer in the Kalamazoo County Sheriff's files on the Estes Bennett murders. The file contained Ohio police reports showing that Dillon had borrowed 2 guns from 2 co-workers to go hunting on November 17th, 1990. Now, that's the day of the murders. He returned the guns later, but failed to return the barrel of one of the weapons, saying he had inadvertently thrown it away. The files showed that Dylan had registered a deer kill in Ravenna, Ohio at 11:20 a.m. on November 17th. Moreover, Helen Knopf was taken to Ohio where she and her son, who had accompanied her to the ditch on the day the car was stuck, both viewed Dylan in a lineup. Both identified him as the man in the car in the ditch. At the time of the crime, Knopf had given a description of the car which resembled a car that belonged to Dylan's wife. However, despite the identification, police had cleared Dylan of involvement in the slaying because of a miscalculation. Police had estimated that Dylan would not have had enough time to drive from Ravenna to the Fulton game area. In fact, Dylan could have driven there in enough time to commit the murders. In September of 2019, the federal court put Titus's federal habeas corpus case on hold while the Michigan Attorney General's Conviction Integrity Unit, also called CIU, could conduct an investigation. The CIU ultimately collected more information, including that the FBI had conducted surveillance of Dylan and documented occasions when he would drive hundreds of miles from home. In addition, Dylan picked up his shell casings and left no evidence at any of his murder scenes. One of his killings occurred on November 10th, 1990, 1 week before Estes and Burnett were killed. And he killed another deer hunter on November 28th, 1990, 11 days after the murders. On February 22nd, 2023, the CIU filed a stipulation to the pending habeas petition outlining the newly discovered evidence about Dylan and agreeing to a new trial and to Titus's immediate release. A companion filing by the MIC noted that at the time of the crime, Knopf had helped police create a composite sketch of the man in the ditch. The sketch, quote, bears a striking resemblance to Thomas Dylan. The filing noted that Dylan had borrowed a gun from a coworker, which had 2 interchangeable barrels, one for buckshot and one for slugs. Dylan failed to return the buckshot barrel. Quote, the use of 2 different shotguns is consistent with the theory that Mr. Estes and Mr. Bennett were killed using 2 types of shotgun ammunition. Dylan died in prison in 2011, and because he died in prison, they are unable to 100% link him to the murders of Estes and Bennett. Their cases remain unsolved today and will more than likely remain that way. On February 24th, 2023, U.S. Judge Paul Borman granted Titus's writ of habeas corpus and vacated his conviction. Titus was released later that day, more than 20 years after his conviction. On June 1, 2023, Kalamazoo County Prosecutor Jeff Getting agreed to dismiss the charges. The 71-year-old Titus declared, quote, all I can say is, I am an innocent man. I am glad to have this off my head and that I can get on with my life. I have no hard feelings because it doesn't help me to let that eat at me. He also had donuts waiting for everyone afterwards and continues to be a frequent customer of Sweetwater's Donuts. Titus was awarded $1 million in compensation by the state of Michigan in August of 2023, $50,000 for every year that he was incarcerated. In September of 2023, Titus also filed a $100 million federal civil rights lawsuit against detectives Workema and Brown. Brown still believes he arrested the killer and says, quote, if I arrested him, then he was the killer. Workema declined any comments. Another small fact, if the judgment is in favor of Titus, then because the officers were working for the PD at the time, then the police department's insurance will pay that sum out to Titus. Over 30 years have passed since that tragedy in the woods occurred, and the wife of Estes still feels the pain of his loss and wishes justice to be served, but also says she doesn't want a man who did not commit the murder to spend his life in prison. Bennett's elderly mother still feels the pain as well. Perhaps down the road they will be able to have some justice served, at least in the absolution of knowing who ended their loved ones' lives. Isn't that nuts?
That's crazy. So they kind of just arrested this guy Titus because he was, I don't want to say like a local bully, but he was very protective of his land. And he had a few choice words because he was probably a muchacho, hunter type, uber masculine type. And he thought that talking shit about guns and killing was, macho.
Right.
But because of that, he ended up spending 20 years in jail because he was a little bit of a dickhead.
Yeah. I love that term, by the way.
So let that be a lesson to all the dickheads out there. Watch what you're saying. Don't be such a dickhead. Otherwise, you too may get accused of murder that you may not have committed.
Exactly. Well, to me, it's like, okay, so they open up this cold case and it's just like, boom, like we've talked about so many times before, tunnel vision. Tunnel vision. Hey.
Yeah, they just get stuck on one person and then they try to prove that that person did it instead of proving who actually did it.
Yep. That's a shame. This isn't the first case that we've done on this show about being wrongfully convicted and spending a huge chunk of your life in prison. So, it's just kind of mind-blowing to think how many innocent men and women are in prison for crimes they didn't commit.
Yeah, it's kind of bonkers. But at the same time, maybe that's the double-edged sword of technology and where we are in society now, because everywhere, even in the woods, they have cameras now, like those motion detector cameras are in the woods all over the place. So everything is televised, so to speak, nowadays. So you don't have to rest on your laurels, especially if you're a little bit of a dickhead. Somewhere, somehow, someone will have a picture of who's where.
Yeah, exactly. Someone's always watching.
Someone's always watching somewhere.
So
There's always a camera rolling somewhere. So in today's day and age, maybe things like this aren't so readily happening, hopefully.
Yeah, yeah. Be mindful and don't go picking your nose in public, right?
Right? That's what I mean, a double-edged sword. On one hand, it's like, oh my God, there's always eyes watching you somewhere. But on the other hand, when people are breaking the law, whatever they're doing, stealing, murdering, causing mayhem, it's going to get caught. And we would hopefully years to come, we won't have so many people in prison, innocent people in prison.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of that movie. I think it was Judge Dredd and Sandra Bullock, where it was like, I can't remember the year that it was based, but it was futuristic. But that's basically the thing. Like, because there's so many cameras everywhere, and because, science and all that stuff, it's like you can't commit a crime in the future basically without getting busted.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know why this case made me think about that, but that guy that got put in the ditch, that we would have known he was in the ditch. We would have located him because there would have been some kind of photos somewhere of him in town.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, that right off the bat is highly sus. Why didn't you dig deeper on that guy? I mean, they looked into him, like, oh, he couldn't have done it. But it's like, guess what? Yeah, he could have. Why is that guy in the ditch? Why is he freaking out? Why does he not want the police? Why does he not want any help? I mean, come on.
Yeah, that whole thing was kind of sus. I don't know why that didn't make it into Titus's trial at all.
Yeah.
Titus didn't have the greatest defense attorneys, apparently.
Right. And why in the hell didn't they bring in these other people who could have proven that it wasn't this Titus guy?
Yeah, like his alibi people. They weren't really involved in the trial either. That's
Yeah.
kind of crazy.
Yeah, they wanted to slam dunk. Ooh, look at us. We just opened this cold case and solved it. Boom. Oh, it's too bad. It's sad.
It is too.
Yep.
It is sad, but now he's out and he's got a pocket full of change that he probably wouldn't have had because before then he was kind of floundering a little bit.
Yeah, he was having a hard time. His trapping business was going downhill, and he was, hustling, trying to make some money, and now he's rich as shit.
Yeah, so he went to prison and he's got a retirement account. Not too bad. Not too bad.
It's like a 20-year job, and he made more money than most people.
Exactly. That's horrible. But it's kind of true. It's funny.
Yep.
It's all in how you look at it.
It sure is. Perspective. Well, thanks, Angela, so much. I just think that's crazy that your sister-in-law bumped into this fella and they just struck up this conversation, and here we are talking about it on our podcast. Pretty cool. So, well, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. And hey, guess what?
What?
Our 100th episode is coming up on Wednesday.
Oh, wow. Wow, that went fast.
Yeah, 100 episodes on Wednesday. So make sure you guys tune in. It's going to be fun. So thanks, everyone. Have a great week. And we will see you back on Wednesday for our 100th episode. Have a great week, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.